My name is Naomi Carter, and I'm 25 years old. And if you've ever been the reasonable one in a family that rewards the loudest liar, then you already know how this starts quietly, politely with you swallowing things you should have spit back out years ago. I didn't grow up in a house where people screamed every day. That would have been easier, honestly. Screaming leaves bruises you can point to. My family was subtler than that. My family specialized in tone and raised eyebrows, in the kind of disappointment that could silence you mid-sentence. And for as long as I can remember, the rules were simple. My older brother could do no wrong, and I could do everything right and still somehow be a little too much. My brother's name is Dorian Carter. He's 29, and he's been the golden child since the minute he learned to smile on command. When Dorian turned in homework late, my mother said it showed confidence. He wasn't afraid to challenge authority. When I forgot to mow the lawn one time in 10th grade, I got grounded like I'd committed a felony. When Dorian wrecked my dad's car senior year, he blamed the intersection, said it was poorly marked, like the road itself had personally targeted him, and somehow that story ended with him getting a newer car. Meanwhile, I paid for my used truck by working nights at a gas station for 3 years. No pity, no praise, just a shrug and, "That's what you're supposed to do." And the thing is, I tried not to make it about gender because life is messy and families are complicated, but it was hard not to notice how my mother spoke about us like we were two different species. Dorian was driven. Dorian was misunderstood. Dorian was meant for bigger things. I was intense. I was too sensitive. I was always keeping score. Even when I was calm, I got accused of being angry. Even when I was silent, I got blamed for tension in the room. I learned early that fairness didn't live in our house, image did. College made it clearer. Dorian had his entire education paid for, start to finish, like it was a birthright. I didn't even know there was a college fund until freshman year when I asked my mother for help with textbooks, and she said almost casually, "We use most of it already. Sorry." She didn't even look guilty. She said it the way you'd say you were out of milk. So I took out loans. I worked during the day and studied at night. I learned what it felt like to be bone-tired at 20, staring at a ceiling and wondering if this was just my role forever. My dad tried in his own quiet way. Edwin Carter wasn't a loud man. He didn't slam doors or lecture anyone into submission. He was the kind of father who slipped you cash when he could, who asked if you'd eaten, who watched you from the doorway like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the right shape for it. Sometimes he gave me advice, soft, careful words about keeping my head down, about choosing my battles. I used to think he was passive. Later, I'd realize it's possible to be both kind and trapped at the same time. Then Dorian landed a job through one of my mother's golf friends, a PR role that paid him more than I made after 4 years grinding in logistics. He acted like he'd clawed his way up from nothing, like he'd been sleeping in a car and eating cold soup out of cans, when the truth was, he'd been walking on padded carpet since day one. My mother ate it up. Every sentence Dorian spoke sounded like a TED Talk to her. Every sentence I spoke was a little rude, a little aggressive, not the time. And then my father got sick. Stage 4. Pancreatic cancer. No warning. No long buildup. One day he looked tired. The next, a doctor was using words like 6 months and palliative like they were ordinary. I remember the room when we got the news, sterile, too bright, humming with fluorescent lights, and I remember how my mother's face changed. Not grief first, calculation first, like something inside her started organizing itself into columns and rows. That's when things shifted in a way that still makes me sick to think about. Dorian suddenly became the caretaker, in quotes, because what he really became was the performer. He posted photos holding my father's hand, wrote captions about being so grateful for every moment, and called himself Dad's Rock. Meanwhile, I was the one driving my father to chemo. I was the one filling prescriptions and arguing with insurance reps who spoke to me like a nuisance. I was the one managing bills and checking bank statements and making sure my dad's pain meds didn't run out on a weekend. I burned through my vacation days, then started taking unpaid time off, then started sitting at my desk at work with my jaw clenched so tight I could feel my teeth aching. I didn't even resent Dorian at first. Not fully. Grief makes you weirdly generous for a while. You tell yourself everybody processes differently. You tell yourself maybe he's trying in the only way he knows how. But then I'd hear my mother on the phone with friends, her voice warm and proud, talking about how amazing Dorian was, how he'd stepped up, how he was such a devoted son. And I'd be standing in the kitchen, exhausted, holding a folder of medical paperwork, and it felt like watching someone else get credit for the life you were bleeding out to hold together. In the last few months, my dad got quieter. He didn't talk much during the day. At night, when the house finally settled, he'd call me into his room. Small gestures, a hand motion, a look, and we'd talk in low voices while the rest of the world slept. He told me he was proud of me, told me he was sorry he hadn't been more vocal over the years. Once he said, "I've got things in place, Naomi. I want things to be fair." I didn't ask what he meant. In that moment, I thought he meant emotionally fair, like a father trying to right old wrongs with words before it was too late. I had no idea he meant legally. He passed in early spring quietly at home, the kind of quiet death that feels wrong because the world keeps moving anyway. Cars still drive by. People still laugh outside the sun. Still shows up like it didn't just lose someone. Dorian made a long post online, a black and white photo of him holding Dad's hand like an influencer tribute. I didn't even know he'd taken that picture. It felt intimate in a way that made my skin crawl like grief had become content. A few days after the funeral, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table. No preamble, no small talk. She just looked at me like she'd rehearsed this and said, "Your father left everything to Dorian." I stared at her. I genuinely thought I misheard. I said, "Everything." Like what? The house, she nodded once, neat and firm. Everything. He wanted to keep things simple. Dorian will handle it. My chest felt hollow. I asked if there was a will. She said yes, but it was private. She said my father wanted it that way. I asked to see it. She said no. Trust the process, she told me, like this was a customer service issue. Your father knew what he was doing. That sentence hit me in a place deeper than anger. Because I did trust my father. I trusted him even when he disappointed me. I trusted him even when he stayed quiet. And something inside me, a part I'd kept small for years, whispered, he wouldn't do this. Not after those late-night talks. Not after telling me he wanted things to be fair. I tried to give my mother the benefit of the doubt. I tried to believe there was context, paperwork, a reason that made sense. I even tried talking to Dorian like an idiot, hoping maybe he'd soften now that Dad was gone. He didn't. He smirked. Actually smirked. And said maybe Dad just saw who really cared. That was the moment something in me went cold and clear. Not rage, not hysterics. Just a quiet, terrifying understanding. They weren't just taking from me. They were rewriting reality. They were taking my father's last months, my work, my grief, my love, and turning it into a story where I didn't matter. And I didn't know it yet, but right then, sitting across from Dorian with his smug little half smile, I made a decision that would set off a chain of events that cost me my job, my reputation, and the last shred of peace I had left. Because I stopped playing nice. After Dorian said that maybe Dad just saw who really cared. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even argue. I remember standing there nodding once, like I'd accepted the answer. Because I knew something then that I hadn't fully understood before. If I reacted emotionally, it would be used against me. My family had always been good at that. Any crack in my composure became proof that I was unstable, dramatic, difficult. So I swallowed it. I walked away. And I started paying attention. At first, I tried to do everything the right way, the reasonable way. I told myself there had to be paperwork, that my mother wasn't stupid enough to just say a will existed without backing it up. I asked politely for documentation, not demands, not accusations, just, can I see the will? Every time the answer was some variation of not now, or it's being handled, or my favorite, your father wanted this to be simple. Simple for who? I reached out to one of my dad's old friends, a lawyer. He'd known for years, the one he'd once mentioned handling his estate planning. I didn't accuse anyone. I just asked if he'd been involved recently. The answer was a pause, then a careful no. I haven't handled anything for your father in a long time. That set off my first real alarm, because my dad wasn't the kind of man who procrastinated on things like that. He was quiet, yes, but thorough. He liked things settled, written down, locked in. So I called the probate court. I told myself it was just curiosity, just due diligence. The clerk looked up my father's name and said there was nothing on file. No will submitted, no estate opened, no probate case at all. At that point, enough time had passed that something should have been moving even slowly. Instead, there was nothing. A blank space where my father's entire life should have been legally accounted for. That's when the pit opened in my stomach. Either the will didn't exist, or someone was deliberately keeping it out of the system. I texted Dorian again this time, asking directly for a copy. Not emotionally, not aggressively, just a simple request. He left me on read for 2 full days. Then he finally responded with one sentence that told me everything I needed to know. "It's not your concern anymore. Please respect Dad's wishes. Not your concern." I read that message over and over each time, feeling something inside me harden. I was his daughter. I was there when he couldn't stand on his own. I was the one holding a trash can while he threw up after chemo. Dorian had posted filtered photos and called it caregiving. And now I was being told to respect wishes that nobody would even let me see. That's when I booked a consultation with a lawyer. Nothing dramatic, no lawsuit, just a conversation. I wanted to know if I was crazy for thinking this felt wrong. The lawyer was calm, direct, the kind of man who didn't waste words. He told me that if there was a will, it should be going through probate unless everything had been placed into a trust. And if it was in a trust, it would still be unusual for one child to be completely excluded without documentation. He leaned back, looked at me, and said, "Something smells off. Keep digging." Apparently, my digging didn't stay quiet for long. That's when the weird stuff started. The first thing was a letter from my apartment complex's HOA. It said there had been multiple complaints about noise and aggressive behavior. I live alone. No parties. No loud music. No guests. I called to ask what exactly the complaints were, and the woman on the phone sounded uncomfortable. She said they were anonymous, but described violent outbursts and screaming matches. I almost laughed because the image of me screaming at my walls was absurd, but I could feel the intention behind it. Someone was creating a paper trail. Then HR called me in. An anonymous complaint had been filed, claiming I was harassing a female family member over money and exhibiting unstable behavior. I remember sitting there, hands folded, listening to the words like they were coming from underwater. I explained calmly that it wasn't true, that there was a family dispute, yes, but nothing remotely like what was being described. HR nodded, wrote notes, and told me they needed to review the situation. I was asked to take a week off. I knew immediately where it was coming from. It wasn't just Dorian, it was my mother too. They were trying to paint me as a problem before I could become one. If I looked unstable, greedy, or dangerous, any legal challenge I made would be easier to dismiss. Even if it didn't fully work, it could scare me into backing off. And for a while, it did. My company didn't fire me outright. But a few months later, during a restructuring, my position was eliminated. Officially, it wasn't related. Unofficially, I knew better. HR doesn't forget anonymous accusations about threatening family members. That kind of stain doesn't wash out. I tried talking to my mother one more time, not yelling, not accusing. I told her I know something's wrong. I know Dad wouldn't have done this. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look surprised. She sipped her tea and said, "Your father made the best decision for this family. If you can't accept that, maybe you need to step back and reflect." Reflect. It was like talking to someone reading from a script. No emotion, no doubt, just deflection wrapped in calm superiority. Dorian blocked my number not long after. Then he posted an Instagram story with the caption, "Cutting off toxic people even when they're blood." My mother liked it. That was the moment I understood the game. They weren't just cutting me out of an inheritance. They were erasing me, rewriting me into the villain so they could sleep at night. And if I pushed back the wrong way, they'd finish the job. So I did the one thing they never planned for. I disappeared. I stopped responding. I stopped explaining. I took a remote job in another state doing systems admin work. Nothing flashy, just quiet, steady income. I moved into a small rental with no neighbors and a busted driveway. I cut contact with everyone connected to my family. I let them believe I'd given up. Because sometimes the most dangerous move isn't attacking. It's stepping out of sight and letting people expose themselves. And for almost a year, that's exactly what I did, until one afternoon my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. And everything changed. For a long time after I moved, my life felt like it was happening underwater. Everything was muted. The anger, the grief, even the relief I experienced, all of it at a distance, like I was watching someone else try to rebuild from a wreckage that didn't technically belong to her anymore. I worked, I slept, I ate, I paid bills, I existed, and that was the point. I wasn't trying to win yet. I was trying to survive without giving my family anything else they could twist or weaponize. The house I rented sat at the end of a gravel road half hidden by overgrown trees. The driveway was cracked and uneven, and when it rained, water pooled in ways that made me nervous. But it was quiet, no neighbors watching, no family friends dropping by with fake concern, no unexpected knocks on the door. At night, I'd sit on the back steps with a cheap beer and let the silence settle into my bones. Sometimes I hated it. Sometimes I needed it more than anything. I didn't tell anyone where I was, not coworkers, not extended family, not old friends who still followed my mother on social media and might accidentally let something slip. I changed my routines. New number, new email, new life that didn't include explaining myself to anyone. And slowly something strange happened. The noise stopped. No more HOA letters. No more anonymous complaints. No more whispers reaching my employer. It was like once I stepped off the board, the pieces stopped moving. That's when it really hit me. They didn't care about peace. They cared about control. As long as I wasn't pushing back, they didn't need to keep attacking. Silence suited them just fine as long as it wasn't theirs. That year, I rebuilt everything from scratch. Not in a dramatic montage kind of way. In the boring, grinding way no one writes inspirational posts about. I learned how to budget on less. I took freelance work when my main job slowed down. I fixed things around the house myself because I couldn't afford a handyman. I cried alone on birthdays and holidays. I ignored family group chats I was technically still in, but no longer welcome to speak in. Every so often I'd catch myself wondering if I'd overreacted, if maybe I really was being dramatic, if maybe this was just how families worked, and I'd failed some unspoken test. Those thoughts always came late at night when exhaustion softened my defenses. And every time they did, I'd remember Dorian's face when he said Dad saw who really cared. I'd remember my mother telling people I was unstable. I'd remember sitting in that HR office nodding calmly while my reputation quietly collapsed, and the doubt would harden back into resolve. What haunted me most, though, wasn't the money. It was my father. In quiet moments, I replayed our last conversations over and over, trying to hear them differently. I've got things in place, Naomi. I want things to be fair. At the time, I'd taken that as emotional closure, an apology wrapped in pride. But now with distance, the words felt heavier, more deliberate, like he was trying to tell me something without saying it outright. My father wasn't paranoid. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't do grand gestures or secret tests. But he was observant. He saw things he didn't always confront. And toward the end, when his body was failing him, I wondered if his trust in the people around him had begun to crack. That thought stayed with me. I kept my head down for nearly a year. No contact, no updates, no social media posts hinting at my location or mindset. If my family looked for me, they didn't find anything. And I let them believe that meant I'd lost interest, that I'd moved on, licked my wounds, accepted my place in the story they'd written for me. Then, one afternoon, while I was halfway through reheating leftovers, my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally, I let those go to voicemail. Too many spam calls. Too many bad memories tied to unexpected voices on the other end of the line. But something about this one made my chest tighten. A feeling I couldn't name, like a thread being pulled somewhere deep inside me. I answered. Naomi, a man's voice asked, tentative but certain. Yes, it's Frank, your dad's cousin. I hadn't heard that name in a year, maybe longer. Frank was never close, but he was always around at cookouts, standing off to the side with a beer listening more than talking. He was one of the few extended family members who never openly took sides after my father died. Quiet. Neutral. The kind of man who watched storms instead of running into them. What's going on? I asked, already standing. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then he said, I found something. And you're going to want to sit down. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mind immediately went, worst case, new accusations, more lies. Another attempt to pull me back into chaos. But Frank's voice didn't sound like someone calling with gossip. It sounded unsettled. I was clearing out your dad's old storage unit, he continued. Your mom never closed it. The company called me because I was listed as an emergency contact. I figured I'd take a look before they auctioned it off. I gripped the edge of the counter. There was a box, he said slowly, with an envelope inside. Sealed. Your dad's handwriting. It says to be opened by me if anything seems wrong. Everything in my body went still. My father didn't leave dramatic notes. He didn't hedge bets. He didn't plan for betrayal out loud. And yet, there it was. a contingency, a quiet safeguard left with someone he trusted just enough to act if things went sideways. Frank swallowed. Naomi, it's a copy of your dad's will, not a draft, not notes. It's signed, dated, witnessed, notarized. I sat down hard, the floor cold beneath me, and I whispered, "It's an even split," he said. 50-50. You and Dorian. Everything. In that moment, it wasn't relief that hit me. It was rage. Not the explosive kind, the kind that burns slow and clean, stripping away every last excuse I'd been given. They hadn't just pushed me aside. They hadn't misunderstood my father's wishes. They'd lied. Deliberately. Repeatedly. And they'd been counting on me, never finding proof. Frank wasn't done. There's more, he said quietly. Journals, financial records, notes from your dad. It all points to the same thing. He wanted this to be fair. I closed my eyes, my father's voice echoing in my head. I've got things in place. And suddenly the year I'd spent disappearing didn't feel like running away anymore. It felt like the calm before a reckoning. I didn't tell Frank to mail me the documents. I didn't ask him to scan them. I didn't even pause long enough to think through logistics. I just said I'm coming to get them and hung up before my hands could start shaking. 6 hours later, I was on the road driving through the night with nothing but gas station coffee and a single thought looping in my head. Don't let this disappear. The whole drive, my emotions came in waves. First, disbelief like this was too clean, too perfect, something I'd wake up from. Then fury, hot and sharp, aimed squarely at my mother and Dorian. Then grief again, heavier than before, because now I understood what my father had tried to do, and how badly it had failed. He trusted the wrong people at the worst possible moment, and I'd paid the price for it. Frank lived in a quiet town that looked like it had been paused sometime in the early 2000s. Nothing flashy, nothing new. When I pulled into his driveway, he was already waiting on the porch holding a manila folder like it was fragile. We didn't hug. We didn't do small talk. He just handed it to me and said, "I'm sorry it took this long." Inside, we spread everything out on his kitchen table. The will was real. Signed and dated, 3 months after the date my mother claimed my father had changed his mind. 2 witnesses. A notary stamp that made my lawyer brain, newly activated, painfully cautious, relax just a fraction. This wasn't a maybe. This wasn't circumstantial. This was solid. But the will wasn't the worst part. There were journal entries. My father's handwriting shakier near the end, but unmistakably his. Short notes about conversations with my mother and Dorian, about how they'd reassured him that everything would be handled fairly after he was gone, about how they promised to take care of me. One entry dated less than a month before he died ended with, "I hope they remember what I asked." That line broke something open in my chest. There were financial statements too, printed emails, old school stuff, the way my dad did everything. And when you lined it all up, a pattern emerged that made my stomach twist. Assets that should have been frozen, accounts that should have gone through probate, money that shouldn't have moved at all quietly rerouted within months of his death. They hadn't waited. They'd acted like there was nothing to contest, nothing to explain, nothing to file. I drove back home with that folder buckled into the passenger seat like it was a living thing. When I got there, I didn't sleep. I scanned every page, backed it up digitally, saved copies to multiple drives, uploaded encrypted files. Paranoia, maybe. But I'd already learned what happens when you assume people will play fair. Then I called my lawyer. He didn't even try to hide his reaction. The silence on the other end of the line stretched just long enough to be terrifying. Then he let out a low breath and said, "This is it." He explained it in plain terms. If my mother and Dorian had submitted a different will, one cutting me out, and this one had a later date, that wasn't a misunderstanding. That was fraud. If they hadn't submitted any will at all and just moved assets around like they already owned them, that was even worse. That meant they'd bypass probate entirely, which is illegal in about a dozen different ways. And the house I asked. Frozen, he said, if we move fast. So we did. We pulled property records, bank transfers, account closures, title changes. Everything they'd assumed no one would bother to check. Turns out a couple of months after my dad died, my mother and Dorian liquidated a major investment account and transferred it straight into one under Dorian's name. Not an estate account, not a trust, just his, like it had always been meant for him. The house transfer was worse. A quick claim deed, a signature that didn't match my father's, no witness, no notary. Just my mother's handwriting and a forged name on a legal document that handed my father's house to my brother like a gift bag. They didn't even cover their tracks. My lawyer shook his head when he saw it. They thought you'd roll over, he said. That you'd sulk, maybe complain, then disappear for good. They were right about one thing. I had disappeared. But I hadn't stopped watching. We filed a petition with the probate court attaching a certified copy of the real will. We asked for emergency relief freezing any remaining assets and launching a full investigation into everything that had been moved. The papers went out fast. No warning, no heads up, no dramatic phone calls. Just a legal envelope landing on their doorstep like a thunderclap. I won't pretend I didn't imagine their reactions. Dorian, who blocked me like I was an inconvenience, suddenly being forced to explain where hundreds of thousands of dollars went. My mother, who told me to reflect and accept my father's wisdom, now scrambling to hire an attorney to justify forged documents and missing money. But as satisfying as that was, something else settled over me. This wasn't about getting my half anymore. This was about what they'd done to a dying man who trusted them. And I wasn't going to let that slide quietly. Once the petition was filed, time stopped being theoretical. Everything moved fast and slow at the same time, fast in paperwork, deadlines, and phone calls. Slow in the way dread stretches seconds into hours, when you know people are finally being forced to answer questions they never expected to hear out loud. The first thing the court did was freeze what it could. Accounts that still existed were locked down. The house, my father's house, was placed under restriction, so it couldn't be sold, borrowed against, or quietly shuffled again. The illusion of control my mother and Dorian had been living under cracked the moment that happened. You can feel it when people realize the rules they ignored are suddenly very real. My lawyer and I built the case the way you build a wall, one brick at a time. We laid out timelines, date of death, date of asset transfers, date of the forged deed date. The investment account was liquidated. We matched signatures, compared notary stamps, pulled bank authorization logs. There was no dramatic gotcha moment, just an overwhelming accumulation of proof that said the same thing over and over. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. Behind the scenes, they started panicking. The first settlement offer came less than 2 weeks after they were served. 15% of the estate if I dropped all claims and agreed not to pursue anything further. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a number tossed out like hush money. I didn't even feel tempted. It was insulting in a way that made my jaw ache. The second offer came through their attorney a week later. 25% plus a confidentiality agreement. I remember reading that part twice. They wanted to steal from me, lie about it, and then legally gag me so I couldn't say what they'd done. My lawyer asked if I wanted to counter. No, I said. Tell them we'll see them in court. That's when the pressure campaign started. Distant relatives began reaching out people who hadn't checked on me when I lost my job or moved away. Suddenly very concerned about family harmony. One aunt told me I should be the bigger person. An uncle warned me about airing dirty laundry. Someone actually said, "Your father wouldn't want this." That line hit a nerve. I told my lawyer to respond to one of them politely once by forwarding the court filing. No commentary, no explanation. Just documents. Funny thing about paper trails, they don't argue back. After that, the calls slowed. People don't like moral lectures when they come with receipts. Dorian tried to delay his deposition, claiming emotional distress and work obligations. The judge denied it, ordered him to appear or face contempt. My mother's attorney attempted to frame her as confused, grieving, just following her son's lead. That didn't hold up long once the forged signature came into play. Forgery doesn't care about intent. It cares about ink and evidence. The third settlement offer arrived right before depositions were scheduled. 40%. Same NDA. Same request to make it all go away quietly. I told my lawyer to say no again. By then it wasn't about percentages, it was about consequences. Depositions were brutal. I wasn't in the room, I didn't need to be, but my lawyer filled me in afterward. Dorian contradicted himself within the first hour. Claimed he didn't know about the will, then admitted my mother told him there was one. Said he assumed the money was his, then admitted he'd never seen paperwork confirming that. My mother did worse. She insisted my father authorize the deed transfer verbally. When pressed about the signature, she claimed stress. When asked why there was no notary, no witness, no probate filing, she had no answer. They turned on each other faster than I expected. Emails surfaced, texts, banknotes. Each new document tightened the net. And through all of it, I stayed quiet. I didn't post. I didn't vent. I didn't explain myself to anyone who wasn't legally required to listen. I let the system do what it's designed to do when people get sloppy and greedy. Then came the diner request. A message from an unknown number. Polite, almost desperate. Please meet us. We need to talk. It doesn't have to end like this. I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete it and never look back. Another part, the part that had been dismissed, minimized, and lied about for years, wanted to see them now stripped of certainty, scrambling for leverage they no longer had. My lawyer gave me one rule: public place daylight witnesses. So I agreed. And as I put my phone down, I realized something strange. For the first time since my father died, I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I chose the diner on purpose. It wasn't nostalgic, it wasn't dramatic, it was bright, busy, and ordinary, the kind of place where nothing explosive ever really happens, because there are too many witnesses and not enough privacy. If my mother or Dorian thought they could cry, yell, or spin a scene into something sympathetic, this setting shut that down before it even started. They were already there when I walked in. Dorian sat on the inside of the booth, sunglasses on indoors, like he was trying to hide from daylight itself. My mother sat across from him, back, straight hands folded, dressed like she'd just come from church. Soft colors, modest jewelry, the visual language of reasonable. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary just looking at them, and it struck me how much smaller they seemed, without the weight of certainty behind them. Not physically, emotionally, like actors waiting for lines that no longer worked. I slid into the booth without greeting them. For 10 full seconds, nobody spoke. Then my mother cleared her throat. We didn't mean for things to get so hostile. Hostile. That's what she called a year of lies, forged documents, and quiet character assassination. I didn't interrupt. I just let her keep talking because she always told on herself when she was nervous. We thought we were doing what was best for the family, she said. Your father, he wasn't himself toward the end. He was confused. We didn't want to burden you with decisions that would only cause pain. Dorian finally spoke, his voice flat, rehearsed. This doesn't need to go any further. We can settle this privately. Be civil. Civil. Like calling HR and accusing me of harassment was civil. Like telling people I was unstable was civil. Like stealing from a dead man and his daughter was civil. I leaned back and smiled, not because I was amused, but because I could feel the power shift, settle into place. You forged documents, I said calmly. You moved assets without authority. You lied about a will that exists. You told people I was dangerous, so I wouldn't challenge you. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's fraud. Dorian's jaw tightened. You're ruining this family, he snapped. The mask cracked just enough to show the anger underneath. That was the moment. I didn't ruin anything I said. You just didn't think I'd fight back. My mother's voice softened, desperate now. If this goes public, it'll affect our reputation. People will talk. Your father wouldn't have wanted that. He also wouldn't have wanted his signature forged, I said. But here we are. Silence dropped over the table like a weight. Neither of them had a response. Not a real one. Not anymore. Because this time I wasn't asking. I wasn't explaining. I wasn't trying to be understood. I was stating facts, and facts don't care how long you've been someone's mother or someone's favorite child. I stood, reached into my wallet, and placed a 20 on the table. Covered my coffee. Covered theirs. Petty maybe, but it felt right. The next time you want to talk, I said you can do it through your lawyer. And then I walked out. No shouting, no tears, no dramatic exit, just the quiet finality of someone who knows the conversation is over. A week later, the court accepted the will, the real one. Assets were reversed, accounts reopened, the house frozen, then marked for sale. Everything my father owned was pulled back into the estate where it should have been all along. And for the first time since he died, the story stopped being theirs to tell. I didn't attend the final hearing. I didn't need to. My lawyer called me afterward and told me the judge didn't hold back, called their actions egregious, said exploiting a dying man's trust was unconscionable. 20 years on the bench, and this one stood out. My mother cried in court. Dorian stared straight ahead like he couldn't process what was happening. I felt nothing. Not joy, not vindication. Just release. Because sometimes justice doesn't feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like finally putting something down you were never supposed to carry alone. The consequences didn't explode all at once. They arrived the way winter does, quietly, steadily, with no concern for who thought they were prepared. The court ruling accepting my father's real will was only the beginning. Once that document was validated, everything that followed became inevitable. Every asset that had been moved without authority had to be accounted for. Every shortcut my mother and Dorian took came back to haunt them with interest. The judge didn't just reverse transactions, he scrutinized them. Dates, signatures, intent, patterns. And the pattern was impossible to ignore. The house was the first domino to fall. Because the quick claim deed was voided, the property legally snapped back into the estate. Dorian couldn't sell it. He couldn't refinance it. He couldn't even officially live in it without court permission. He fought it, of course, filed motions claiming emotional attachment, childhood memories, hardship. The judge denied hit every single one. Sentiment doesn't override fraud. 2 months later, the house was listed for sale. I never went to see it. I didn't need to. Frank told me it sold to a couple with 2 kids and a dog. Clean offer, no drama. Dorian had to move out fast, hired movers last minute, left behind furniture he couldn't afford to store. For someone who always assumed the world would bend around him, reality hit hard and fast. Then came the money. The court ordered full financial disclosure. Every dollar that had passed through my father's accounts after his death had to be traced. Problem was, Dorian had already spent a lot of it. Private gym membership, a rented BMW, first-class flights for networking. All on money that was never legally his. The judge didn't care how it was spent, only that it was owed. He was ordered to repay my half, which meant selling the car, breaking his lease, taking a job he'd once mocked administrative work in a warehouse office park just to avoid a lien on his wages. The golden child aura evaporated overnight. Frank mentioned seeing him carpooling with coworkers, head down, no sunglasses anymore. My mother's losses weren't as visible, but they cut deeper. Once the forged paperwork and lies came out, her reputation imploded. The church volunteer board quietly asked her to step down. Friends stopped inviting her to things. The same women who used to nod along to her stories about Dorian's big career now whispered when she walked into a room. That's the woman who stole from her daughter, they said. She went from queen of the neighborhood Facebook groups to a cautionary tale. I didn't have to say a word. The court documents spoke louder than I ever could. Recovery damages were awarded, legal fees, lost value, restitution. My lawyer told me the judge called their behavior a betrayal of familial trust and basic legal duty. He cited my father's journal entries directly pointing out how clear his intentions were and how unconscionable it was to exploit his final illness. That word stuck with me. Unconscionable. It wasn't just illegal, it was inhuman. I wasn't in the courtroom when the final orders were read. I was at home, making coffee, listening to my phone buzz on the counter. When my lawyer confirmed it was done, I thanked him and hung up. No tears, no cheering. Just a long exhale I didn't realize I'd been holding for years. I cashed my checks, bought a modest duplex out of state, kept working, quietly, carefully. They tried to erase me with lies. All it took to stop them was truth, patience, and paper. And that was the real checkmate. After the rulings, life didn't explode into something cinematic. It settled. I stayed where I was, bought a modest duplex, and kept my routines small and deliberate. Work, home, quiet evenings, no announcements, no victory laps. Peace, I learned, isn't loud, it's consistent. And consistency was something my family never gave me, so I gave it to myself. I never spoke to my mother or Dorian again. There were no apologies worth hearing and no explanations worth revisiting. They understood the boundary the moment the law stopped protecting their lies. Silence this time belonged to me. What I kept wasn't the money. It was clarity, the certainty that my father tried to do right by both his children, even when his strength was failing. Months later, I framed an old photo of us fishing, me squinting into the sun, him showing me how to tie a knot. It sits on my desk now, a reminder of who he was before illness and manipulation hollowed everything out. I didn't burn the bridge. I just stopped crossing it.